Welcome to the Beer Taster's Notebook, the show dedicated to learning about beer. I'm Jonathan Thompson, advanced cicerone, beer judge, home brewer, and beer writer. Over 90% of the beer consumed worldwide is some form of lager. Pilsner variants have become synonymous with beer. Incredibly well marketed, it's consistent, and it's clean. There's no banana, pineapple, barnyard, or dank forest floor to work through. It's just clean and easy. It's like Mozart. We can explore this in more detail later on, but the main difference between an ale and a lager is yeast time and temperature. So lager fermentation takes place much cooler and uses bottom fermenting yeast, and then the lagering process itself involves maturing the beer at near freezing temperatures for up to a few weeks. Lager comes from the German word lagern, which means to store. But let's explore how this came to be. So the story really starts in the early 13th century in the Kingdom of Bavaria, centering around the great brewing city of Munich. Now, brewing at this time was still very much a domestic endeavor, with any commercial operations, if we could really even call them that, taking place at the monasteries. In fact, a lot of the major breweries in Bavaria were spawned by monastic brewing. München, which was originally a monastic settlement, was called zu den München, to the monks. And at this time in brewing history, yeast was really still an unknown quantity, but brewers becoming a bit suspicious that this froth on top of the beer might be doing something. And so they started skimming it off and introducing it to the next batch. Similar practices, of course, were happening elsewhere in the forms of things like the sticks that they were using to stir their beer, or the Kveik rings, which have become quite famous recently. And so this unintentional repitching of yeast, as opposed to just allowing the beer to spontaneously ferment, which is allowing airborne yeast to settle in and kind of get to work, would have triggered the selective pressure that shapes the characteristics of successive generations. So something that they noticed was that although yeast in general prefer warmer temperatures, in certain situations, warmer conditions were causing it to behave in fairly unsavory manners. And the colder temperatures were in fact yielding a better product. So just to reiterate, they still don't know what yeast is, but they do know that they're getting a better end result. Now, some seasonal preference for cooler fermentation already existed at this time. Warmer temperatures would have accelerated spoilage, and this became quite obvious. Also around this time, copper comes into play. And as brewing had been done exclusively in wooden vessels previously, like all of it, including the boil, which, as you can imagine, was not ideal. I do think I should mention that they accomplished the boil by introducing super hot rocks into the wort. They didn't direct fire the wood vats as much as I kind of wish they had. Anyways, so perhaps coincidentally or catalytically, private breweries started creeping up around this time as well. So in 1516, the famous Reinheitsgebot is introduced. It's not actually called this at the time, but nevertheless, the essence is still the same. So it restricted brewing of beer to, with the ingredients, to water, malted barley, and hops. Yeast still remained quite elusive. So to satisfy the preference for cooler fermentation, beer was being stored in caves. There's still a lot of mystery around the origins of this practice, because it is told that monks would brew and the beer and then store it up in alpine caves. This might be the case, but it seems quite peculiar to brew something, then transport it up a mountain to mature, and then haul it all the way back down the mountain. So in 1553, Duke Albrecht V institutes a rule that brewing can only take place between St. Michael's Day and St. George's Day, which is September 29th to April 23rd. And this basically seals the deal for cold weather brewing. And then that results in two sort of major styles, Winterbier and Sommerbier. So for Winterbier, we get continuous batches, obviously, throughout the year. But Sommerbier, because of this extended period where you cannot brew, you need beer that's going to be stronger, so it's going to last longer. And also the longer maturation is going to mean a drier beer. So all of this goes on for some time. And then in the 1830s, brewing really starts to take off. So the brewers start to use ice in the caves with sawdust for insulation. This would have provided some smoothing of the temperature fluctuations, and it just definitely accelerated this very long path to the smooth and consistent product that we're looking for. 1833 marks the birth of important change. The sons of four brewers, who are brewers themselves, take a trip through Europe, visiting various brewing centers in a sort of an educational quest. Their names are Josef Mendel of Braunau, George Lederer from Nuremberg, Anton Dreher from the Kleinschweststadt brewery in Vienna, and Gabriel Sedlmayr II from Spaten in Munich. The latter two will prove to be very instrumental in the perfecting of lager beer. So the four of them eventually ended up in London, where they found it a bit challenging to get the kind of access they wanted to, but nonetheless, they did come away with some invaluable information. So the use of a saccharometer, which is for measuring the sugar content in beer, and which we also call a hydrometer, the consistent use of thermometers, which everyone knows what that is, and probably the most important is they came away with British malting techniques. So Josef and George parted the other two and went back home, and then Sedlmayr and Dreyer traveled north to Edinburgh. And here, they are allowed much more access. They're getting into the breweries, they're getting up close and personal with the fermentation tanks, and in like a cloak and dagger type maneuver, they fashioned these wine thieves into their walking sticks, and they would walk around and dip them into the fermentation tanks, extracting fermenting wort, and then bring it back to their hotel. So basically, they had this, this yeast bank of stolen yeast in their hotel room in Edinburgh. They were also fortunate enough to work alongside a Scottish brewer named John Muir. He became so intrigued with this bottom fermenting process that later on in 1835, Sedlmayr sends over some of Spaten's yeast. Muir then brews what is believed to be Great Britain's first lager. Unfortunately, successive generations of the yeast became unviable, eventually died, and that was it for lager in Britain for about another 100 years or so. And so when these guys returned home, they expeditiously got to work implementing much of what they'd learned. Sedlmayr was apparently mocked by the other brewers for using a thermometer. I guess they all just guessed, but we can see how that turned out. And then perhaps, as mentioned before, the most important factor here is the adoption of British malting techniques. So it yields a paler, much less smoky malt, which also contained more fermentables. So Dreyer developed what we now call Vienna malt, and Sedlmayr Munich malt. So not really creative names, but at the very least they're descriptive. And so in 1837, Spaten releases a new Märzen beer, and includes the descriptor Helles. Helles meaning pale, not something more sinister. And of course, pale would be relative because the beer they were drinking back then was quite dark. So this beer would probably pale in comparison to the paleness of current beers. Sorry. But it was definitely paler than what they were used to at the time. So in 1841, which must have seemed like a lifetime later, Dreyer releases his version of the new beer called lager beer. And it's the first use of the word lager in the name of beer. We call the modern version Vienna lager, which again is a super creative name. The success of both of these beers really allows these breweries to rise in popularity, capturing significant market share, and to expand. They installed steam engines in their breweries, and then they eventually started absorbing smaller operations. The two men died eventually, which was common at the time. Well, I mean, I guess people still die, so it's still common, but they passed their legacies on to their sons, and that's where we will leave off Bavaria for now. So at the exact same time as these two brewers who we just met were rising to fame, another situation was percolating up about 300 kilometers northeast of Munich in the town of Pilsen, in the Kingdom of Bohemia, which is now in modern-day Czechia. The town's middle-class citizens were referred to as burghers, and I'm going to mention this because it creeps up again and again in beer history, so just having a definition is probably useful. So a burgher is defined as a respectable and free citizen. It's not a serf, but they're also not nobility. It comes from the Dutch word burger, and it is synonymous with the French bourgeois. Anyways, the beer here was brewed by the citizens who were adorned with brewing rights. They brewed it at home, sold it to taverns and the like, and it was described as brown, smoky, and sweet. Apparently, it was also extremely bad. And it was so bad that in 1838, the town basically revolted and dumped a significant amount of it. And then they petitioned to be able to construct a new citizens brewery and malt house. They were permitted to do so, and so the construction began. Quite sensibly, and considering the reputation for quality, it was decided not to allow the citizen brewers anywhere near it. Bavaria, of course, had this stellar reputation for superior quality beer, and so they did the only reasonable thing and hired a Bavarian brewmaster. His name was Josef Groll. And in Mark Dredge's excellent A Brief History of Lager, it reads, "A common man of simple manners, whom his own father referred to as the grossest Bavarian in the whole of Bavaria. Nice father. So the combination of Bavarian brewing techniques, quality control, and a very soft local water yield a pale, crisp, and refreshing beer. It was released in 1842, and the town had never seen, or more accurately, tasted anything like this. Unbeknownst to them, this sparkling golden lager would change the face of beer around the planet forever. So moving back to Bavaria for a minute, in 1850, the ban on summer brewing was repealed. This method of filling the caves with big blocks of ice and sawdust proved to be fairly effective at maintaining a somewhat ideal temperature, and there was really no longer a need for seasonal restriction. Then in 1857, as part of Louis Pasteur's treatise on yeast, he also suggests that the lagering process is helping to keep spoilage organisms at bay, giving an extra boost to lager's credibility. And then in the 1870s, Carl Lind's industrial refrigeration system, the first of which, by the way, was installed at Spaten, really helps to stabilize temperature fluctuations and reduces the need for the labor-intensive harvesting of ice. I mean, prior to this, they're going to frozen lakes, cutting giant blocks of ice and then storing them in sawdust and hauling them back. Also around this time, German brewers start producing their own versions of the popular Czech Pilsner. With a higher mineral content in the water and different hop character, it yields a more hop-forward and crisper beer. And even though there's no real hard line in the sand, northern German Pilsners do tend to be cleaner and more bitter, while the southern versions are less bitter, more aromatic, but a little bit softer and rounder. Then in 1871, Bavaria joins the German Union, and in 1900, the Union adopts the Reinheitsgebot, this time including yeast. So let's step back a little bit in time again. And I know it's a bit nonlinear, but it's probably smoother than jumping from place to place, adhering to the timeline. So Copenhagen, Denmark, in 1835, Jacob Christian Jacobsen reluctantly takes over his father's brewery. In 1836, he tries some Bavarian beer and he immediately decides that he needs to start making this. And he does. And by 1844, he's brewing enough that he needs more space, and he applies for permission to build some lagering tanks under the fortress walls. While he's waiting, he heads off on a trip. At the part of that trip, he ends up in Munich, where he meets Sedlmayr. And then the next year, he goes back to acquire some of Spaten's yeast from him. The trip home is something of legend because he carries the yeast back in a tin, and then he continuously is stopping at rivers and ponds to cool it down, which is pretty smart. Eventually, he decides he needs a bigger brewery and discovers a suitable location on a hill. Now, Jakob has a son named Carl. Bjerg is the Danish word for hill, so I think you can see where I'm going here. Carlsberg's contribution to the beer world is paramount. They built an in-house lab. Contamination and souring were still a major problem back then. They called it beer sickness. And they tasked their new lab director, a gentleman by the name of Emil Christian Hansen, with solving the issue. So in 1883, he isolates the first pure yeast strain, and this might actually be overlooked as the most important development in the history of beer. Not only does a pure strain allow you to control and isolate desired characteristics, but it also allows you to eliminate all other yeasted microbes that contribute any undesired characters. Now, of course, spoilage via poor hygiene or negligence remains a risk even today, but that sort of roulette wheel of yeast pitching is forever thrown in bin 13. So moving into the late 19th to 20th centuries, German and Czech migrants are bringing their brewing practices all around the world. One such place, obviously, is the United States of America. Now, originally, brewing in America was dominated by sort of English styles brought over by the English, coincidentally. But in 1840, John Wagner arrives in Philadelphia, and he was a Bavarian brewmaster. He brought some German lager yeast. He somehow managed to keep it alive on the ship. And he started brewing at home, and he was also reportedly very generous in distributing his yeast to others. And now remembering that American barley is dominated by the 6-row variety, and while that means better foam, it also means more suspended particulate, fewer fermentables, and a higher propensity for chill haze. So brewers start experimenting with the adjuncts of various types to try and to solve these issues. One such adjunct, which of course is available in abundance, is corn. But there's a problem with corn. There's a bunch of oils in there, which are a foam destabilizer and can contribute some serious off flavors when they go rancid. In 1868, a man named Anton Schwarz arrives from Bohemia and gets to work on adjuncts. He soon discovers that there are certain varieties of corn that have much lower lipid fractions and therefore don't possess the same negative attributes as the other corns. And so by the end of the century, corn holds a solid seat in the assembly of adjuncts. Now, big brewers are dominating the market, and at this time, sort of the great homogenization starts to begin. Then all of a sudden, Prohibition strikes. Post-Prohibition, although the great beer engine was really sluggish to restart, the big brewers again begin to dominate. Clever advertising, bottling, canning, and then home refrigeration really helped to solidify the mass market lager as a household item. The industrialization of the product doesn't really help matters either. So technology like high pressure fermentation, extracts and syrups, and then high gravity brewing, which is where you brew a lower volume to a higher ABV and then water it down. These all serve to really further mute the expression of flavors in the beverage. And then when the ultralight and diet beers come along, I mean, the flavor gods just retreat back to Mount Olympus. So another thing that happens around this time is in the 1930s, Heineken shows up in America and captures a massive chunk of the market. It relies heavily on the mystique of imported European beer. In fact, it still does. I mean, if you drink anything in a this is a tangent here. If you drink anything in a green or clear bottle, with the exception of certain stabilized products like Miller, you'll be familiar with that skunky aroma. And so it's called 3-methyl-2-butane-1-thiol. It's often called just 3-MBT, light struck, or skunking. It's the result of the photooxidation of certain hop acids. It's been touted as a European quality. It's not European. It's an off flavor. Although allegedly, when certain breweries switched to cans from green bottles, consumers complained so much about the missing European skunk quality. And so allegedly, they pre-skunk the beer before they put it in cans. Heineken's popularity, however, really helped to calcify European mass market lagers across American shelves. And so now we have what feels like a sort of a communal vat of just standard, plain, yellow, and uninspired beer. Then the 1980s come. The craft revolution really helped to pull that quantity versus quality gap back in line. And although, the industrial complex continues to rule, as is evidenced by most people's fridges and garage floors, there are many carefully crafted small batch lagers from which to choose. And of course, I implore you to do so. And so that's how it came to be. But let's talk about what it is. So because lagers are fermented and then matured, both at lower temperatures, several things happen. So the yeast itself, which ferments 5 to 15 degrees centigrade versus the 17 to 24 degrees centigrade for ales, it tends to throw off far fewer esters and phenols, but more sulfur products. And these, like hydrogen sulfide, which is that eggy smell, are produced during the growth phase. But luckily, they are fairly volatile and they tend to dissipate quite quickly, A, during the lagering phase, but B, once you open the beer. Lagering yeasts also have the ability to digest melobiose. This is a reducing sugar consisting of a glucose and a galactose unit, whereas ale yeast cannot. So the yeast contain the MEL1 gene, which encodes the production of alpha-galactosidase enzyme, and that breaks the sugar down. Now, the residuals in ale is minimal and negligible, but I wanted to tell you about it anyways. So conversely, the lager yeast tends to differentiate from ale yeast in other gene expressions, limiting other specific enzymes. So I could talk for hours about yeast, which I will, but not today because we're talking about lagers, not yeast. So another feature of cooler fermentation is a slowing down of the metabolic process. And this means that certain enzymes like esterases are going to be less active, meaning fewer esters, of course. Lower amino acid metabolism results in fewer fusel alcohols. And without those alcohols to combine with organic acids, once again, we get fewer esters. A slower metabolism also means that any acetyl-CoA is going to be reserved for energy. And that means that the excess cannot be pulled back in to form further aroma compounds. So as you can see, just during the fermentation, we're already starting off with a cleaner beer, if we want to call it that. And then the lagering process itself is going to allow a lot of flavors to clean up. So these temperatures are down at, anywhere between 0 and 4 degrees. The yeast, though, does remain somewhat metabolically active. And as we remember, it behaves better at lower temperatures. So during this period, diacetyl, which is that buttery popcorn aroma, can be slowly reabsorbed and reduced to acetone and 2,3-butanediol, which are fairly odorless. Although if you're a drinker of certain Czech Pilsners, you'll recognize that not everybody got the memo. Acetaldehyde, which is that green apple, pumpkin guts, latex paint, avocado type aroma, it can be further reduced to ethanol. And then any esters and fusel alcohols can be slightly decreased just via hydrolysis and oxidation. And then also, those sulfur compounds we discussed, like hydrogen sulfide and sulfur dioxide, can be slowly volatilized off because of the release of the carbon dioxide. They just kind of get carried away with it. This longer rest period also encourages the binding of polyphenols to proteins, allowing those complexes to drop out of solution, which makes a clearer beer, and it eliminates or at least drastically reduces chill haze. So in the end, we're left with a very clean beer as far as fermentation products go. And this allows the malt and the hops, and then to a small degree, the water, to shine through. So if you want to think about a Weiss beer with that big nose of that clove like phenol and the banana-like esters, any major hop aroma or malt aroma is going to just play second fiddle. But in the case with lagered beers, like a Munich Helles, the bready malt really comes through front and center with those hop notes sort of lingering in the background. And then with the German Pils, you get those floral hops right up front, and then it's supported by the malt, but none of these are being taken away by any fermentation character. I would like to mention again, though, that a slight sulfur whiff is very common in lagers, but it does tend to blow off fairly quickly. Now, of course, the world of lagers is quite varied. We've discussed the Munich Helles, we've discussed the Pilsners. Munich Dunkel is a darker, sort of high, rich, malty, toasted bread crust type of flavor. There's Märzens and Fest beers, which are a little bit toasty. Vienna Lager, which we alluded to earlier, which is kind of like a Märzen, but a little bit lighter, slightly more bitter and with a drier finish. There's the Schwarzbiers, which are sort of a black lager, which is they're sort of malty with a little bit of roastiness, not quite going into stout or porter territory, of course. Rauchbier uses smoked malt, so it's got some smokiness. And then there are all the Bocks, which are the stronger beers, much more malty, almost no hop presence whatsoever. It's a huge world to explore. And that is exactly what we'll do in future episodes, going through each style's unique history and attributes. Until next time, stay thirsty and stay curious.